Third, as noted earlier, provide incentives for shutting down coal clunkers. And fourth, sponsoring a hard-hitting public awareness campaign that compares the benefits of clean domestic natural gas with the risks of coal and oil, the spill in the Gulf, $1 billion a day for oil imports, mountaintop removal, ruined streams, the proliferation of toxic metals in our environment. These are very tough tactics, but we're not playing beanbag here. Your competitors are defining the agenda, and you have to fight back. Nor is legislation the only option available. Another venue of equal and even greater importance is the vast regulatory framework that touches the energy industry every day. Most of your industry probably has an aversion to regulation of any kind, but I will argue that the underlying public purpose of regulation is in your interest and can be greatly beneficial. It's time to think a little more creatively about how regulation can work for the natural gas industry, how regulatory action could benefit natural gas. How can you take advantage of EPA and its legislative mandate? And especially, how do you use the far-reaching authorities of the Clean Air Act? To review the legal landscape very briefly, in 2007, the Supreme Court found that greenhouse gases, quote, fit well within the Clean Air Act's capacious definition of air pollution, unquote. In response, EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson last year made an endangerment finding that the current and projected concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, quote, threaten the public health and welfare of current and future generations. These actions have very far-reaching implications for your industry. A new set of rules coming out of EPA could require utilities and other major polluters to limit their emissions, but give them the flexibility to do so as inexpensively as possible. The effect would be to establish a cost for emitting carbon, and that would cause significant fuel switching to gas. This has not gone unnoticed by your competitors, who are doing everything in their power to persuade Congress to intervene and to prevent EPA from regulating under the Clean Air Act, as EPA was authorized to do by the Supreme Court's decision. The dirty little secret of the energy bills in the House and the Senate is that muzzling EPA is the #1 goal of the coal industry and their allies, for the simple reason that if regulation goes ahead, they will lose and you will win. The Dirty Fuel Alliance knows that the stakes are very high, and they are very well organized, lobbying heavily, building constituencies, and twisting arms to achieve their objectives. Just as the old industries have a huge amount to lose, the gas industry has a huge amount to gain. It is in your interest, perhaps even your #1 authority, to defend EPA's authority. This is a battle that gas must win. Nor is the importance of EPA's authority limited to greenhouse gas emissions. EPA's actions on conventional pollutants may be even more significant. Over the next 3 years, EPA will issue several new regulations under the Clean Air Act that will affect coal-fired power plants. The natural gas industry should be lined up to advocate for the strongest possible rules, to defend these rules in court, to preserve EPA's authority from congressional attack, and to assure that the states apply these rules. These new rules, which are required by existing law, could well cause the shift of a substantial part of our generating capacity to gas, amounting to trillions of cubic feet per year of increased demand. Let me give you just one wonky example to illustrate. This last April, EPA proposed a new emissions rule for industrial, commercial, and industrial boilers, known as the Industrial Boiler Maximum Achievable Control Technology Standard, the Boiler MAC rule for short. It is scheduled to be finalized by the end of this year. Under the Clean Air Act, EPA must decide what technology qualifies, meaning which boiler fuel technology will reduce emissions the most at an acceptable cost. EPA will then mandate its use. But switching to gas is not one of the options being considered by EPA. Why? Because your opponents are all over Washington, lobbying against fuel switching because they would lose and you would win. Using well-packaged but grossly out-of-date information, your competitors have persuaded EPA that there is not enough natural gas supply to support fuel switching. This rulemaking vividly demonstrates that the gas industry needs to get into the action and mount an effective regulatory campaign. In this case, just very simply to point out the excessive amounts of available natural gas, contrary to what your opponents have been arguing and is now in the EPA agenda. And it's not that the boiler rule is the most important opportunity available. Rather, it's just one example of a number of decisions in the EPA pipeline that have important implications for natural gas demand. Others include the coal ash rule, interstate air pollution, new standards for particulate matter and for ozone and for sulfur emissions. The list goes on and on. If the industry does not engage in this fight, it will find itself closed off from a significant market, and you cannot avoid the fight unless you simply want to wave the white flag. Coal is already on the warpath, depicting gas as an economic and security risk. In May, a representative of the electrical industry warned Congress that EPA's regulatory actions pose, quote, untenable risks, including the near-term retirement or conversion to natural gas of a substantial portion of the coal-fired generation fleet, that there's a risk for the transition to natural gas. I mean, quite a preposterous statement to be making, but seriously being advocated in front of the Congress. Those risks to coal are opportunities for gas in legislation and in regulation on Capitol Hill and at EPA. But to seize the opportunities, you will have to think anew, build different coalitions, seek out new allies. They are out there. You must find them, listen to them, and work with them. Your success here in Colorado is an excellent example, and we've talked about that before. That's the kind of coalition building that ought to characterize your efforts across the country and in Washington. Politically, what happened here was that the gas industry, the utility, and the environmental community came together, and that strategy ought to be replicated. It's time to stop fighting your old enemies and start developing new coalitions. If the first part of the game plan for natural gas is to increase demand, the second must be to minimize the risk of environmental damage and concern. Vela's suggestions were a good start. In this day and age, responsible regulation to protect health, safety, the environment, and the community is simply the price of doing business. The status quo is not good enough anymore, not after the Gulf, not after Gasland, not after blowouts, and not after stories about water faucets that you can light with a match. Responsible regulation rewards the good performers and weeds out the bad, and that's a good thing for any industry. For your industry, which has spent tens of millions of dollars on advertising to brand natural gas as clean, responsible regulation is the parallel path. It is utterly essential. Without it, you might as well flare your advertising dollars. And more to the point, you'll be flirting with public sentiment that can deny your right to operate. For starters, there are 5 steps that should go into an essential work plan for responsible regulation. First, support public disclosure of fracking fluids. There is no flashpoint as sensitive as the Safe Drinking Water Act. No issue affects you so immediately, and none is moving as rapidly in the public conscience. As in so many other industries, food, auto safety, finance, disclosure is the minimum requirement for showing that you support the public interest. Second, create a joint working group with regulators, public health officials, and environmental advocates, as suggested earlier today, to determine what other regulatory controls could make the most sense as national standards. Third, consolidate the industry's best management practices and agree on standards that would form the basis for good rulemaking with the states. And fourth, dramatically shift the footprint of gas exploration and production. Drill pads, roads, pipeline corridors, and the rest, also suggested this morning. This is an opportunity to create efficiencies, reduce costs, and improve profits by applying best industry practices for pooling and utilization. And finally, support adequate state funding, oversight, and enforcement of regulations. Sound regulation can be very good for your industry. This will require your involvement as well as your understanding that good rules are meaningless without good enforcement. Of course, good regulation has to be sensible, and that's exactly why you have to engage in constructive dialogue with regulators, environmental and public health groups, as well as the public at large. You need to actively establish and support those forums so that gas can prosper. This brings me to my third and final theme. You can't get anything done without building alliances, and I've noted that throughout. This is not an easy process, but it's essential. We're entering a new world with new economies, new security worries, and new global concerns. We need new alliances and new ways of thinking to meet these new challenges. To carve out a special role for natural gas and energy policy and to take advantage of being the clean fossil fuel, you need to align the industry with people and groups that you may have viewed with some suspicion in the past. We've already talked about three examples: regulators, environmental groups, public health authorities. A fourth is the renewable energy community. Renewables symbolize the new energy economy. Wind and solar industry have very broad public support, and nearly every world leader is pointing to new energy technologies and transition to a low-carbon future as the foundations of a 21st century economy. As a general proposition, natural gas should be a prime partner in this kind of global coalition. You are uniquely equipped to balance out those resources when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. In the near term, this may be an awkward relationship. In many markets, depending on regulations, contracts, and the time of day, natural gas and renewables are competing for market share on the margins of the much bigger energy pie that is being protected by the dirty old incumbent suppliers. They throw you and the renewable community a few crumbs, and you compete for them. A perfect strategy to keep you off balance and in conflict, even though the public favors cleaner fuels. The long-term strategy is to get you together, natural gas and renewables working in tandem to increase your share of the pie. The big opportunity is to advocate for cleaner, more sustainable U.S. energy mix with more renewables, more efficiency, and more natural gas. The wrong approach, a recipe for conflict, is to try to squeeze gas into renewable energy standards that are too small to begin with. There is not enough political space for that fight. You end up hurting each other, and your competitors laugh all the way to the bank. A better approach is to work together for more ambitious, low-carbon energy standards that increase the market for gas and renewables alike. The old way of doing business was to go it alone, to resist government oversight, to minimize environmental concerns, to stonewall the public with whom we disagreed. Now it's time for a new way, to evolve into a broader